So welcome everyone to the NARA webinar here in June. And we have a really exciting program for you. Beginning the process, reparative descriptions at NARA and at the State Archives of North Carolina and the Alabama Department of Archives and History. So to get started, I'd like to first turn this over to Meg Phillips with NARA to give a brief welcome.
Thank you, Lisa. And this will be a very brief welcome on behalf of the National Archives. I think this topic is really a perfect example of how government archivists at the state and national level can share information that's really going to be helpful to all of us about how we're approaching a kind of work that we do not have the same kind of long history doing that we have with appraisal and description. So I think we can really learn a lot from each other, and we're looking forward to sharing what we've been up to. I'm also delighted to be co-hosting with Joy for the first time. So welcome, Joy. I'll turn it over to you.
Meg, I'm really glad to see you again. So I am Joy Banks, the new Executive Director of As always, we are delighted to partner with NARA in this ongoing series. We appreciate this and all of the support that NARA Territorial Archives. So today our speakers will address this complex but critical conversation of reparative and conscious description programs. This really seems like an excellent complement to COSA's recent cultural competency workshops, as well as our budding establishment of a new committee for inclusivity, diversity, equity, and accessibility, or IDEA. So I really hope that everyone here today finds the presentation both challenging and encouraging as we really take this journey together. And I'll pass things back to Lisa and thank her in advance for her moderation of this session.
Thank you, Joy. So now the next part is we'll have our presentations from our three presenters, and then we'll have a period for question and answer. And if you have questions as you think of them as you go along, you're welcome to type them in chat, or when we get to question and answer, you can raise your hand and unmute and ask your question that way. So let me introduce you to our presenters today. Jill Reilly is our first presenter, and she is the Digital Engagement Division Director for the National Archives and Records Administration, or as we know it better, NARA. And among her many accomplishments, Jill was the Archive's first social media manager. She leads the National Archives Catalog Description, Catalog Technical, and Authorities and Standards programs. And she coordinates the Description subgroup of the NARA Reparative Description and Digitization Working Group. In her federal career, she has also served at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the U.S. Department of Education, and the Library of Congress. She earned an MLS in Archival Administration and an MA in U.S. History from the University of Maryland. Our second presenter will be Ashley Yandle. Ashley has worked for the State Archives of North Carolina for 21 years. She has had various roles during that time, including arranging and describing special collections and state agency materials, digitizing collections, and overseeing a social media and other online access. She has led the Archives Conscious Description Committee since its creation in July of 2020, and in January of 2022, she became the head of the Digital Services section. And our third presenter is Dorothy Gidiere. Dorothy is an Archival Collections Coordinator at the Alabama Department of Archives and History. Before joining the ADAH in 2013, Dorothy previously worked for Ancestry.com. She holds a Master's of Arts in Public History from Middle Tennessee State University, a Master of Library and Information Science from the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and is a certified archivist. Sorry about that, people. So with that, I'd like to welcome our presenters, and I will turn it over to Jill so she can begin her presentation.
Hi, everyone. Just want to say thank you very much to Lisa and Joy and Meg for those introductions, and also just very happy to be participating in this panel and have the opportunity to speak with you all today about this important topic and how we've been starting the work in reparative description at the National Archives and Records Administration. So this afternoon, I'll be talking about some of the context and strategy for this work at NARA, our engagement with communities, reparative description principles, framework, approach, and guidance that we've been developing at the National Archives, how we're setting up our pilot, the training that we are developing, and the next steps for us. So to put this in context, the reparative description work that we're doing at the National Archives is very much aligned with our strategic goals and our new strategic plan. So you can find the strategic plan on archives.gov. We have a new plan that's for 2022 through 2026. And the reparative description work that we're doing aligns with strategic goal 1 around make access happen and enhance description for underserved communities, collaboration with traditionally underserved communities to correct outdated descriptions is a key part of this work, and that's where the reparative description efforts fall in. And then we're going to be doing collaborative transcription projects and other kinds of collaborative metadata enhancement projects as we move forward, working with some partners and some universities. And then also we'll be exploring options to allow users with limited internet connections better access to the catalog records. This also fits in with our strategic goal number 2 around connecting with our customers, and there's an emphasis here under goal 2.3 around making sure that we focus on equity, accessibility, and diversity in our outreach efforts and our museum education and public programming as well. So as we've been working together in the reparative description and digitization working group that the National Archives established as a follow-up to the Anti-Racism Task Force, the Archivist Task Force on Racism. We have 3 goals, 3 parts of our charge, and they are to first examine the harmful language in catalog descriptions and looking to ensure that records are described in a way that's very inclusive, respectful, accurate, and balancing those concerns with discoverability and access in the catalog, and also developing processes for correcting issues related to under-description and over-description in the records and also in the authority files, particularly the person authority files. We are secondly looking at surfacing records, connecting with communities, talking to them about digitization efforts and new priorities in digitization. And we'll be continuing to, in our digitization strategy, balance high demand records and records of interest from these communities, BIPOC, accessibility, LGBTQA+ communities that we've been talking to. And then thirdly, we're committing to this fundamental principle of meaningful consultation, very deep, meaningful engagement with community partners, stakeholders, to work toward these goals together in a very transparent, very collaborative way. And this aligns with NARA's equity team's work, the earlier Archivist Task Force on Racism that I've mentioned, and then just also overall federal, executive order around racial equity and support for communities. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the work that's been coming out of our reparative description and digitization work group. And we have been moving forward strategically with an iterative approach and piloting plan. And we are really working to learn together and share the lessons learned and bring humility to the endeavor and in our approach. We have been very intentional about creating engagement and feedback loops, both externally with stakeholders that we've been connecting with in the first communities that we've been engaging, the first 2, and also with staff. And that includes our employee groups, our employee assistance groups, our EAGs. We have 2 at the archives, Say It Loud and the African American History Society. And we've been working closely with them and other groups at NARA internally too, making sure that we are staying connected with them and keeping them in the loop. We've been focusing in our pilot, I touched on this earlier, about focusing on legacy catalog descriptions and going through with this reparative description effort there and focusing on what we have to work with. We know it's very important to look at day forward description, and we are starting to talk about that, but the initial push has been around descriptions that are already public and making changes to them. And we are working with folks on the processing manuals that they provide internally to advise this work from a day forward point of view. We've been really deliberately engaging a crowdsourcing approach on the harmful terminology. Anyone is able to submit terms for consideration. This is explained on archives.gov, and it will be part of the materials that we continue to put out related to our reparative description efforts. So folks can email us at catalog@nara.gov with suggestions and link to examples in the catalog that they see, or on archives.gov with harmful terminology that they would like to flag and have put in the queue for consideration. And then this dovetails with the conversations we've been having with stakeholders. They've been really helping us prioritize terms, and then also NARA staff as well. So it's kind of bringing those three pieces together. We've been prioritizing and focused around communities. So first we're working with the African American community, Black community, and then secondly, next group is going to be working with the Puerto Rican community. And we are working on prioritizing terms within those community contexts. We're really working also to be very transparent, provide updates both on archives.gov and in our internal collaboration network website at the archives. And we are being mindful about making it traceable, showing that we made reparative description changes in the catalog. We're working on standard language for our general note, and then also ways to add a variant control number so we can keep track. We're working on providing guidance, training, and support, balancing consistency and flexibility as we move forward. And we're leveraging our existing NARA description community of practice to do this work. So we are working really closely with the DAS, Description and Authority Service System describers. That's the back end for our National Archives catalog that we call DAS. And then every custodial unit at NARA and the presidential libraries and the legislative archives, they all have a DAS point of contact. And, you know, it's the government, so we always want to shorten everything. So the DAS POCs. So we have been talking to them. They'll get a preview of the training. I've been having conversations with them as we're developing the training, gathering questions and concerns from them so that we can address them and be really proactive about incorporating it into the training. So to talk some more about the engagement models, this is a lot of the work that we've been doing in 2021 and 2022. Identifying specific communities for engagement and dialogue. I've mentioned that we focused on working with stakeholders from the African American and Puerto Rican communities. And it's really building a methodology for engagement that is sustainable. We started the conversation with stakeholders from those communities and subject matter experts who work with records related to those communities at the archives, and started with some questions and working through them in sessions. And Meg Phillips is on the RDDWG at NARA with me and has helped, you know, and participate in those conversations, help shape those questions. So just giving Meg Phillips a little bit of a shout out there on her engagement on that. And we've been working through questions, working through things with them, areas to look at, records to consider. It's helped shape the questions in the conversation when we went to our external stakeholders. We've been sort of leveraging those internal stakeholders to inform the conversation that then we take to our external stakeholders next. And there's been a lot of dialogue and good loops and engagement there. So we've been hosting these group meetings. We've also been inviting feedback in writing. And the conversations have been really fruitful. We stay really practically focused. So there's some theoretical aspects to the conversation about the importance of the work, how much language matters, the power of language, but there's also very practical things like talking about certain record groups that they want attention to, certain terms. So a lot of it is very specific, looking for other records where we could collaborate on transcription and thinking about collaboration opportunities. And so we've been really following up very consistently, keeping a rhythm to these meetings, keeping the conversation and the dialogue going and following up there. Talking about where we've been sort of as we've transitioned into more engagement with those external stakeholders. We've been doing a lot of benchmarking research and work and talking to archivists and librarians and professionals at different research organizations, professional associations, some state archives, academic libraries, and been compiling resources that we've all been using to increase our own knowledge, participating in some training that has been available, some workshops from SAA also. And we've also been identifying key organizations in the African American and Puerto Rican historical research communities. So we've been talking a lot to researchers, historians, academics in that information space. And we've been, as I mentioned, developing questions so we sort of bring, again, very intentional framework to the conversations that we're having. And we've been working through with them those harmful terms that I've been mentioning, which is a really key component of the approach that we're making and focusing on specific terms that we'll put into the first pilot, and then we will projectize it and have batches of terms that are mapped to communities and have been prioritized by communities that we will do in a projectized way moving forward. That's, basically how we're going to organize the work on this community by community, project by project basis. It's our way of kind of breaking it up into more manageable, chunks of work for us to be able to move forward. And we've definitely been continuing to just, engage folks really widely, follow up, make sure that there's trust and good dialogue and exchange in these conversations. It's just really important to be listening and following up on what you say you'll do. So we're also very mindful of that in these engagements. Talked a little bit about how they provide a lot of input on terminology. We've also touched base with them as we developed our harmful terminology change proposals. We talked to them about our approaches, validated the additional terms that we will change things to, what that approach is going to be, looking to always use a person first approach. And in a lot of cases, when we're looking at the terms for the African American community, not always just going in and switching a harmful term with a Black or African American, but also just even wondering and asking the describer to think about whether you should just take out the racial modifier and put people first and just change the description so that it's going to say woman in a store and no racial modifier needed in that description, and a subject access point for African American or Black would be how we would handle access. And the original catalog title is going to get moved down there, and we've been talking a lot about that. The stakeholders that we've talked to have definitely been concerned, and we've been really mindful about, again, retaining language, but sometimes, again, in these cases, like de-emphasizing it. So the original title is there, and they don't want to inhibit access and sort of airbrush out or cover over words when that's not helpful, and we've just been really mindful of that. And this has been, again, really fruitful dialogue, and we've really appreciated their input. They've been talking a lot with us about records that are already digitized that they want to see enhanced access to, and they've been talking a lot about records that are not yet digitized that would be very helpful to them. And in the case of the conversations we have with the Puerto Rican community, they're really interested in content that is at different NARA locations that they don't have ready access to for their researchers or their students when they're in Puerto Rico, and they would love to see more of these records digitized. So we've been focusing on future plans for that have been really informed by this input. And we are really looking to, as I've mentioned a few times, really building a relationship, sustaining it, keeping the conversation going, and staying in touch and working together. I wanted to link here to some resources that we've been providing at the National Archives for our guiding principles for reparative description. And later we can make some links available. I can always follow up with Lisa about that. And you can also kind of search for these on the archives.gov site or Google it. And we have our statement on potentially harmful content. And we have this landing page, our updates on reparative description and digitization. And these are three really go-to resources to see the work that we've been doing, and it's really informing and framing the work that we're going to do. Within the next month or so, we are going to make an update to our LCDRG, our life cycle data requirements guide, with a new appendix about reparative description, guidance, and terminology. This slide, I've got a little diagram here, a little workflow about how we've been moving forward with the process and planning for our pilot and teeing that up. So this just kind of gives a graphic to that stakeholder engagement we've been having. We've been doing research and reviewing of terms and putting together draft proposals. We circled back with the stakeholders. We submitted these proposals to our Lifecycle Data Standards Board, and the first batch of terms was all approved. And now we are developing that training and the publishing, and publishing our guidelines in our LCDRG, teeing that up, and then the pilot will begin once we've trained our DAS describers and POCs. And it's a community of about, the archives, we've got about 350-ish users in the DAS system. And so we have a pretty sizable community of practice to train. Talking a little bit here about our authority files and the approaches there. With person names, organization names, federal organizations, we won't be making any changes to the proper names in those authority files, but we will make changes to the notes when they are NARA's words. And we've been trying to make that very clear, just like we're not going to make any changes to records or transcripts of records. We're not going to make changes to those proper names of things. When it comes to geographic names, very similarly, we will not be changing formal names. We are keeping an eye on changes that are occurring, and we'll keep up with that. And we're encouraging our staff as they do this reparative description work to add geographic access points, because then later when the U.S. Board of Geographic Names and Department of the Interior do make updates, we'll be able to push that update to a place name all at once. We see a lot of creeks that we are hopeful those creeks will have their names changed at a future point. And so we're encouraging people to use access points. And with the subject terms, it is a little bit different. We use a sort of a local file that is based on the Library of Congress subject headings, very simplified, not subdivided. And we are looking at making some changes to that. And one example would be looking at changing the harmful term slaves to the term enslaved persons. And we will be making those changes in our local subject authority file. We've been keeping up with just conversations in the cooperative cataloging community, and look to and hope at some point that there will be more changes that we can just continue to align ourselves with, but we will be making local changes in the meantime. In terms of the training that I've been talking about, we're at the point where we have been developing the materials, getting a lot of input, review of the drafts. We did our first run through of it for the RDDWG work group members yesterday. So we have got a lot of great feedback, and it's a training that's about 2.5 hours, and it's meant to be an intro and just a 101 focus on the pilot. I think it's going to need to expand from there to address some of those other description challenges related to other day forward work and where description and processing sort of intersect. But this is more focused on the catalog descriptions and what to do as you address existing description to do a reparative description process on it. And we've been getting input and feedback and having a lot of conversations to make sure that folks are ready for these changes and that we can address concerns, keep moving forward together. We really need to all keep moving in the same direction to advance this work. And we've been talking to our folks across the National Archives. We're going to roll that training out to those DAS POCs, those points of contact first, and then continue to refine a little bit. And we're going to get ready to train all the DAS describers at the end of July. And with the follow-up, we're going to really be offering additional customized consultations for different units or other groups of units that are having similar scenarios that they're seeing as they're looking at these terms related to the Black community, and helping them address anything individually. We discussed having an open office hours, but folks I think are requesting that we are willing to do more tailored consults for them so that they can dig deeper into challenges that they might be facing and consult with us around best practices so we can address it in a consistent way. I've been mentioning that kind of balance of consistency and flexibility, and I just know that in the conversations we've been having, everyone appreciates the flexibility, but they definitely want to be as consistent as possible. And so it's kind of navigating that as part of that change management and getting folks more comfortable with this change. We're going to be doing some surveys before the training, right immediately after the training, and then later in the pilot. And then one idea that came from one of the DAS POCs is to do a lessons learned workshop late in the initial pilot, which will be in December. And then we will be working over the next kind of 3 or 4 months to get started on that initial set of terms that we're going to be addressing. So what's next for us is really getting ready to start that pilot, but the engagement with the internal and external stakeholders will be happening simultaneously with this. And we are really continuing to work with the stakeholders and tee up our next batch of terms. So as we get ready to end the pilot and start the second project and keep going, we will be having everything teed up, have identified the catalog descriptions that need a look, and we'll be going through our pilot review process. Continuing to refine the training. And then as we get ready to revamp just the training for the catalog overall, rather than only have that dedicated reparative description training offering, weave it in more throughout and look at all of our examples from the training that we offer for DAS on online description and kind of revisit it. And we are really excited about these collaborative transcription projects that we've been teeing up, and are looking forward to being able to share more about them as they get more baked and ready to go. And we've been, really been intentional about this pilot, knowing that this work does take time, resources, effort, and energy, and growing expertise around best practices. So we've been talking a lot with the custodial units, making sure that this is included, that there's time and space, percentages of folks' time planned for FY23. Which for us starts on October 1st of 22. A little confusing, but I think you guys all have different fiscal year fun like we do too. And it's not far away. So this is the time of year when we're doing a lot of that planning. And we're also just gearing up for what's to come. The next 1 or 2 communities that we'll be reaching out to talk about these reparative description efforts in particular, gearing up future waves of terms, continuing to analyze and prioritize what's been coming in DAS, and getting ready for what's next. And so in closing, I have these links here. I mentioned a few others. Happy to share that, and invite you to contact us at catalog@nara.gov if you have additional questions, suggestions, or insights you'd like to share. And again, we've been really happy to connect with others and hear. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing from the other panelists here today and the questions and the discussion that we have. Because I think this is, again, a great opportunity to learn from each other and hear what best practices and lessons learned we have to share. So thankful for that. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it back to Lisa and just thank you all again for your attention today.
Thank you, Jill, for that presentation. And so now we'll go to Ashley Yandle, and she's going to talk about what's happening in North Carolina.
Hello, everybody. I'm Ashley Yandle from the State Archives of North Carolina. I'm also the head of the Conscious Description Committee for the State Archives. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of how that committee started and where our work stands. So the committee was created in 2020 with a charter that I've quoted a bit from in the slide. We were intended to have representatives from all parts of the State Archives on our committee, and then to create a roadmap to decenter whiteness, create inclusive and accessible language, and provide greater access to materials documenting the lives of previously marginalized people. The charter further outlined some specific goals that we were to focus on, including surveying division description that we already have established, surveying best practices across archival research, develop curriculum for staff, and create case studies from our existing content. And then also to develop a plan for sustaining the team's work, because our initial charter was only for a year. And then after that first year, we were going to evaluate what was going to what was next for us. So we began with a literature review. I chose to do that in part because I wanted everyone on the committee to be able to start our discussions from a similar level of knowledge. Excuse me. So we began with these three articles to begin with, and then we just started cruising bibliographies to find more content. And as we did, we added to a spreadsheet that we communally kept. People volunteered to read various things or watch webinars or read guidance, so that we would sort of divide and conquer the information that was out there rather than expecting everybody to read everything. And then we shared our findings, what we learned, in both the notes section in the spreadsheet, but also in our meetings when we discussed the articles with each other. After that, we moved on to case studies. We actually focused in 3 different areas: special collections, finding aids and catalog records, government records, finding aids and catalog records, and then descriptions around digitized content in our digital collections. But for the purposes of this talk, I'm only going to be talking about special collections and government records, because there's a little bit of a difference of what digital collections description does and its needs, and we have limited time. So let's talk a bit about government records. So they picked representative samples from county records, state agency records, and governor's records in North Carolina. They ended up doing 9 case studies, and they found that their issues usually boil down to 2 sets of things. Words or phrases that were used, whether they be offensive or archives jargonish language that could potentially confuse non-archivists, or omission of information. For example, records that reference Native communities but don't give tribal information that would be useful for those communities to find and find their own information about themselves. Another example would be they had found harmful language around mental health in the former names of state agencies overseeing the work in those areas. Our policy has always been that when we create creator names, we use the title of the division, department, whatever, what it was when those records were originally created. That meant that even as things moved on and had different names, those legacy names remained in the catalog. They proposed a couple of options for addressing that. One was to move legacy names into a separate field for secondary names, alternative names, and then updating the current name to reflect a more modern name of the institution as it exists currently. Also, they proposed suggestions around adding contextualizing notes to explain where names came from. That instance and case study sort of gave us an insight to something we were going to see a lot of going forward, which was we will both be dealing with harmful terminology and description created by archivists, and then language that came as part of the collection or was part of the collection. All right. For special collections, the Outer Banks History Center is one of our regional institutions documenting the history of the Outer Banks of North Carolina. They ended up doing 5 different case studies on a variety of things. So they surveyed, in one example, they surveyed description on a support group for the Latinx community in the Outer Banks, and found, of course, that what is also true for all of our finding aids, that there's no Spanish language translation for that finding aid. And that's a problem for accessibility in all of our materials, but specifically it's a problem when we're talking about a collection that is about and of interest to communities that may need that translation. In another instance, they came across a collection about a female resident of the Outer Banks, and the biographical description glamorized the successes of her husband and son and used sexist language. The previous title referenced a name that she didn't even use, although it was part of her given name. So the solution there was to update the title of the collection to reflect her name, and then also rewrite that description, that biographical description, to more completely touch on her life and her successes rather than those of her male relatives. Another issue they ran into was finding books related to African American history in our shared online catalog. All the parts of the state archives use the same catalog that is meant for archival description, but the OBHC is both a library and an archive, meaning that they have a book collection. And book description typically doesn't have a lot of content description outside of subject headings, whereas the catalog, basic search determines relevance based on the location of metadata, and the highest degree of relevance is usually in the title. So if the keywords didn't appear in the title, relevant resources could end up further down the list or not showing up at all. Okay, once we had a bit of knowledge about what kind of issues we were dealing with, we began working on draft guidance. We are still in draft, so we don't have a completed thing for people to look at. But I wanted to give you a general sense of what the sections looked like and what the document looked like. So I listed a couple of the divisions inside the guidance itself: language and representation, bias, inclusion, and how to approach sensitive subjects. We also created standardized language to include in notes about edited description or description that is in the process of being edited or will be edited. And in our appendices, we included more specific guidelines of how to describe specific records, special collections, government records, and digital collections. So our to-dos, we have to finish our guidance and get it through the approval process of our management. We're going to need to develop training for staff and create workflows for how potential text could be brought to us. One of the things that came up in a lot of our conversations was the need to be able to have both staff or the general public be able to contact us and say, hey, we saw this text, we think you need to look at it. So we need a mechanism for doing that. Eventually advertise this on our website and provide our guidance, access to our guidance that way. And then also we want to create internships around conscious description. As far as challenges go, so we really struggled in the beginning between what we wanted to focus on, whether it was individual words or phrases or bigger concepts. And really we wanted to do both. That's the problem, because both are important. And so that's still a balancing act we're trying to find a happy medium on. Individual committee members would have different ideas and priorities about which we should focus on. So it was a challenge to sort of meld those into a division-wide plan. We had a discussion about whether we prioritize editing description that's currently being created, acknowledging that we already have a backlog for some things, and we're editing legacy finding aids where we knew that it was likely that the worst examples of description would probably be found. We've had a lot of staff changes. Great resignation has hit all of state government. So that not only affected the membership of the committee, but also the workloads of individual members who were involved in the committee work. Different levels of impact of the work. Our AV materials are described at the item level, whereas county records are described at the box or series or collection. So that impacted that work as well. The different needs of description in digital collections versus the online catalog. And then who's going to do the work? Arrangement description staff, or can we share that out amongst division staff? Because we felt like conscious description work was the work of all archivists, but having a plan of how that would work is still something we're in progress of figuring out. What's next for us? In 2021, we submitted a new charter, so we are going to be a permanent standing committee because we see this as a project and work that is going to be going on for foreseeable future and will need to be sustained and guided. We also set a couple positions as permanent members. Those are the supervisors of the description groups in the state archives. So the head of special collections, the head of records description unit, and the head of the group that does digitization in my section. So then we will also have to get our stuff through approval and get all those other aspects that in our charter online and finished. And then of course we will start this whole thing again because nothing is ever done in this. We will constantly be needing to learn and grow and change as we go along and adapt. And ultimately we would like to work with more communities to find out what they need from us and develop those relationships because there are a lot of challenges there as well. All right, thank you very much. And I will hand off to Dorothy.
Thank you, Ashley. Dorothy, we're ready to hear from you.
Okay, excellent. Excellent. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dorothy Gidiere, Archival Collections Coordinator at the Alabama Department of Archives and History. And today I want to share with you how our conscious description program got started and some challenges that we've encountered along our way, and some ideas also about how we could work together. First, I'd like to just give everyone a brief background about our agency. The ADAH was founded in 1901 by Thomas McAdory Owen and was the nation's first state-funded independent state archives agency. Our mission is to, quote, tell the story of the people of Alabama by preserving records and artifacts of historical value and promoting a better understanding of Alabama history, end quote. When our agency was founded, however, our leaders, including Thomas McAdory Owen and his successor and widow, Marie Bankhead Owen, did not preserve the records of all Alabamians. Instead, they focused on the preservation of Confederate history and lost cause ideals while declining to document the history of Black Alabamians. 2 years ago today, on June 23rd, 2020, our director, Steve Murray, and Board of Trustees released the Statement of Recommitment in response to the murder of George Floyd. With the Statement of Recommitment, our agency acknowledged 3 truths. First, the existence of systemic racism. Second, our agency's role in declining to acquire and preserve materials documenting the lives and contributions of Black Alabamians. And third, that as a predominantly white institution, we cannot know the full measure of fear and frustration experienced by Black Americans. Before the Statement of Recommitment was issued, I was spending a lot of time thinking about the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent protests for racial equality. What could I do as a privileged white woman, both in my personal and professional life? Professionally, for me, the answer was to start reviewing how we had described archival collections about Black Alabamians. I started working with my colleague, collections archivist Jamie Kicklighter, on what has today evolved into our conscious description program. Jamie and I started brainstorming about where to even begin in reviewing descriptions about Black Alabamians. Should we start with collections describing slavery? Should we focus on collections about civil rights? And internally, we were having some separate conversations about a slavery documentation project. So we decided to develop guidelines for describing slavery to work in tandem with this other project. We also formed an informal committee to include our Museum Collections Coordinator, Ryan Blocker, and our Digital Assets Coordinator, Meredith McDonough. Our committee and other archival collection staff spent the remainder of 2020 attending many online workshops, webinars, conference sessions related to conscious description. We also read professional literature and reached out to colleagues to see what they were working on related to conscious description. At the same time, in 2020 and into 2021, we started drafting guidelines for describing slavery. While still a work in progress, the guidelines aim to be a practical guide for processing archivists on preferred terminology and how to use these terms in their descriptive work. They also outline descriptive practices intended to represent the experience of Black Alabamians more fully. So where do things stand today? We are on the first round of internal review for the guidelines for describing slavery. Once our internal review is complete, we would like to then conduct an external review and are especially interested in getting feedback from Black archivists and historians. We also hope to compensate our colleagues for their time and expertise. In the meantime, we are continuing to create a list of collections to review once the guidelines are approved. It's my hope and plan that the guidelines for describing slavery will serve as a model as we tackle other subject areas as part of our conscious description program. We've also realized that there are specific challenges in doing conscious description work as government archivists. First being the fluctuating political environments that we work in. While this varies by state, we all have to be mindful of both politics and our role as public servants. While the ADAH is an independent state agency, other state archives might face limitations from a parent agency, such as a Secretary of State's office. And even as an independent state agency, we still receive our funding through the state legislature and must constantly advocate for sustaining our current funding and increasing whenever possible. Another related challenge is the increasing politicization of language. We've had several internal discussions about what to call this work. Currently, we use the phrase conscious description to indicate mindfulness in our descriptive work. We avoid the use of reparative description out of a concern that reparative sounds too similar to reparations, which might be off-putting to some stakeholders politically opposed to reparations and could derail our work entirely. We also have had internal conversations about making sure that however we describe our work, we're being respectful of our predecessors who are following what were descriptive standards at the time. Next, we also have the challenge of competing viewpoints of our constituents. We want to make sure that we are describing collections of underrepresented groups in a way that will increase access, but we know that these changes might alienate others. I believe it is vital to include citations to professional literature when developing our guidelines to be able to demonstrate the mindfulness that went into our decision-making process. Another challenge when drafting guidelines is deciding who are the authorities in a given subject area. There are many thought leaders and experts, but they don't always agree on preferred terminology. What are the preferred terms used by underrepresented groups, and how do we account for possible disagreements within these groups? And finally, over the last 2 years, it's just become very clear that conscious description is a long-term program, not a short-term project. Back in 2020, I first approached everything from a project mindset. It became very clear very quickly how wrong this was. and that this is just our new normal, and we need to figure out how to integrate conscious description work into our standard workflows. And that we also need to make sure everything we're doing is sustainable for the long term and that it can evolve over time. And for us, this also includes figuring out what's the right time interval. Is it every 2 years or 3 years that we're reviewing any of those approved guidelines and just making sure that they are current? So where do we go from here? I would like to see the state archives community form a working group or cohort where we can work together to tackle these challenges. Following the unconference model used by the Southeastern Archives and Records Conference, or SARC, I think active roundtables where practitioners working on conscious description can talk through both successes and challenges would be very helpful. And with that, I thank you for your time today, and I will pass it back to Lisa.
Thank you, Dorothy, and thank you to all our panelists for your wonderful presentations today. So now is your chance to ask questions of our panelists. And so we already have one here from Amy Saunders. Jill, could you elaborate on what you consider over-description in records?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Yeah, thank you for this question, Amy. It's definitely prompted a lot of conversation and looking at case studies and examples at the National Archives. What we mean by over-description often relates to talking about individuals. So we have a lot of examples that are in the person authority files, but we also have examples that are in the records as well. And so let me look to my my official definition that we've been using internally at the archives. And we've been using this definition for over description as a working definition. That archival description that is extensive and valorizes or emphasizes the contributions of white wealthy men and other groups who have traditionally held power while adding little or no pertinent information about the records. And so we have a lot of examples from NARA's catalog that really go off on a tangent, talking about somebody and their many accomplishments, and it's generally not pertinent to the records. So we're not talking about over description from a more process, more product, less process kind of angle about whether you're describing to what level of description or anything like that. It's really about these tangents when it's talking a lot about individuals that are typically from groups that have held power, and then it's not really adding anything to the description or access to the records. And it really goes together with this definition that we have for under description, that we're referring to description that's short and omits, downplays, or marginalizes the contributions or experiences of Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, LGBTQA+ communities, accessibility community, women, and or other traditionally underrepresented or marginalized groups. And so it's those ones by contrast where we have in somebody's biographical note one sentence or no sentence for that individual that really does need to balance that out, where it's we have some pretty stark examples. So thanks for that question.
Thank you. And here's a question for Ashley. What is the most challenging aspect of the work of a conscious description committee?
Currently, I would say something utterly unrelated to actual conscious description, just say having so many vacancies. You have to have people to be able to do the work. And the last year, 2 years has been tough. A lot of movement going on there, retirements, and also people leaving to go other places. And if it was just us and not across state government, that would be a help, because part of it is that our HR departments are really backed up because it's happening all across state government, which means that not only are positions empty, but they're empty for longer. So if you have a vacancy, other people in that group could be covering that for, a couple of months. And we are all already busy before we even start talking about taking on and wearing additional hats. So that's a big challenge. I'll also add, because since that's a unique experience to right now, I think just breaking down the parts of this into things you could do, because there's so much and it's so overwhelming when you start to figure out exactly what you want to address. But there's also such a need to get started doing something. So figuring out that balance is kind of a challenge, but it's one that I think we can all do. And if we make mistakes, we can go back and correct those and begin again. But the important thing is that we start.
Okay, thank you, Ashley. Jill, this is a question from Sierra Khan. How do you moderate what the public sees, excuse me, what the public sees as harmful? Have you gotten feedback from crowdsourcing efforts? And can you talk a bit about how you address these public concerns and communicate your progress?
Thank you for this question. We're very fortunate to have some community managers for the online catalog that are the main group that does do the moderation for crowdsourced contributions to the catalog, and they also review anything that's flagged or anything that gets caught in a filter in order to be screened. So right now it would be that the community would flag something or that it would get caught in the screening tool. In terms of people also just sending us harmful terms, that's the same team that has that context there that is receiving the questions that come into the catalog at NARA.gov. And so then they are passing on harmful terms. They do send a response message. Thank you folks for sending examples and flagging terms, and then letting them know that it goes into a queue for consideration for prioritization going forward. And we've been sharing our updates with the public on the archives.gov page we have for reparative description and digitization, and we will be continuing to post updates there and letting folks know about the terms, the harmful terms and the preferred terms that have been added to our metadata standards as a result, of this work and where it's coming from. So we're really making sure that we circle back there. We'll always send an email out to our stakeholders that have been working with us on this, but also just sharing it publicly on our website.
Thank you, Jill. Dorothy, what is your advice for anyone just getting started?
Really, for me, for getting started, I think one of the best things you can do is just really embrace the long-term aspect of this work in your planning. It's something that we have realized over time, and like we are making our adjustments, but I think having that as your beginning mindset could be very helpful. And I think really from that standpoint, you can really I think that can help you a lot with your planning and just where you take those first steps. And like what Ashley's speaking to, you do want things that you can accomplish, and just breaking it into and I think Jill spoke about this as well, just breaking it into smaller areas where you can make accomplishments. But I think really just truly understanding that this is an always task. You'll never reach an end point where you can really just done. That you just it's going to it's just going to take time in really changing your workflows and how you approach description.
Thank you, Dorothy. One more question for Jill. This is from Marianne Mason. Jill, can you explain how you went about establishing stakeholders from the Puerto Rican and the African American communities?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So, at the National Archives, we're fortunate to have Ms. Phillips, who does focus on our stakeholder and professional association relationships. So we started in conversations with Meg Phillips, with members of our working group, and started to pull together a list of organizations and thought leaders in this space who've often been speakers on these reparative description topics and have been trainers. So we started with a list and started to reach out, inviting folks to join us for conversations. And we really engaged everybody that responded to us. And so then we've kind of, at the end of each of those conversations, asked if they're willing to keep working with us, keep the conversation going. And it's been a little bit different, you know, working with the two different communities, how it ended up panning out. We often ask them to who else they would suggest we also talk to. And then that's a way that's been helping us expand that network of stakeholders. On the African American history side of things, we've talked a lot with representatives from leadership from ASALH and also from the HBCU Libraries Alliance, and then a number of other organizations, but those are two that we've talked to a lot, and also worked a lot with Dorothy Gidiere from Harvard, and who soon will be at Smithsonian, I hear. And then also on the Puerto Rican community side, we've talked with Hilda Teresa Alaya Gonzalez, you know, who's been General Archivist of Puerto Rico, Interim Director of the National Library. And conversations with Hilda led to connections with other professors at University of Puerto Rico, other historians from the Puerto Rican community that are in Texas and New York. And we've been working with them and talking to some other groups in that space as well. And we've been talking with Meg about engaging others in the international space, in the international archival professional communities, and we've chatted some in particular also with folks at the Canadian archives as well.
Thank you, Jill. Well, we're about the end of our hour, so thank you to all of our panelists for their wonderful presentations, and for all of you attendees for your very insightful questions. We hope you've enjoyed today's webinar, and we hope you'll join us next month for our COSA member webinar, which will be on the America 250. So please register and watch for other webinars as we go along. Our SERI electronic webinars, they take a short break here in the summer. So watch for notice about the fall series as they will be coming along. As always, there's lots of ways to connect with COSA. We hope you'll take advantage and reach out to all of us. And finally, none of this happens without our sponsors and funders, so a shout out to them. And after this webinar, you'll be directed to a brief evaluation survey. I hope you'll take a few minutes and answer those questions. It really helps our education committee as they prepare future programs for you. Let us know what you liked, what's useful. If you have suggestions for other topics or speakers, let us know that as well. So with that, again, thank you, Jill. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Dorothy, for your wonderful presentations today. And thank you, everyone who joined us for the COSA NARA webinar here in June. Have a great day, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Take care, everyone.